Christopher was never the kind of man to fuss over his health. At 62, he carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who had weathered life's storms and still managed to keep a twinkle in his eye. A retired school principal, he spent his days tending to his small garden, walking his golden retriever along the riverside, and enjoying long afternoons with a cup of black coffee and a crossword puzzle. He believed in moderation and balance, never one to chase the latest health fad or magic cure. But that sense of calm was shaken one chilly autumn morning when he woke to a strange heaviness in his body, as if a quiet fatigue had crept into his bones overnight. It wasn't the kind of tiredness that a good night's sleep could wash away. It was deeper, slower, and unsettling. That morning, as he prepared his breakfast, Christopher noticed his hands trembling ever so slightly as he reached for the sugar bowl. He frowned but brushed it off, blaming it on the cool weather. Still, there was an odd sweetness lingering in his mouth, and he couldn't remember the last time he had felt quite himself. A week later, after a routine checkup, his doctor called him in with a tone that immediately made Christopher sit up straighter. "Your blood sugar levels are high," the doctor said gently. "It's more than just a little high, Christopher. We need to talk about the risk of diabetes." The words landed like stones in his chest. He had always imagined diabetes as something that happened to other people, not to a man who still walked daily and kept a watchful eye on his diet. But here it was, a quiet, creeping intruder threatening to change everything. In the days that followed, Christopher found himself unusually quiet, replaying the doctor's words in his mind. He thought about his father, who had suffered from complications of diabetes in his later years, and the toll it had taken on their family. He thought about his grandchildren, their small hands slipping into his as they walked together, and wondered if he'd still have the strength and stamina to keep up with them in the years ahead. There was a flicker of fear, yes, but also something else, a stubborn determination not to let this diagnosis write the rest of his story. Christopher had always been a man of action, a problem solver, and so he decided this was going to be no different. If there was a way to turn things around, he would find it. It was his friend Maria, a fellow retiree who had spent years studying natural remedies, who first mentioned mango leaf tea. They were sitting in her sunlit kitchen one afternoon when she poured him a steaming cup of a golden green liquid. "This," she said with a smile, "is something my grandmother swore by back in Brazil. We had mango trees everywhere, and she always believed the leaves were as valuable as the fruit itself." Christopher lifted the cup to his lips, inhaling the earthy, slightly floral aroma. It was surprisingly smooth, with a gentle sweetness that lingered on his tongue. He liked it immediately, though at the time he had no idea just how much this humble cup of tea would come to mean to him. Maria explained that mango leaf tea was rich in compounds like mangiferin and quercetin, which were known to help regulate blood sugar and reduce inflammation. She spoke of how her grandmother had used it not just as a daily drink, but as a way to keep the body balanced and strong. Christopher listened politely, though part of him remained skeptical. He had heard about herbal teas before, each one claiming to be the key to health. But Maria wasn't selling him a miracle. She was sharing a piece of her family's history, a tradition rooted in generations of quiet trust. And perhaps because of that, or perhaps because he sensed he needed something more than medicine alone, Christopher decided to give it a try. The first week, he drank a cup each morning before breakfast. He noticed, almost without meaning to, that the mid-morning crashes he had grown used to were less severe. The fog in his mind seemed to lift a little faster, and there was a steadiness in his hands that hadn't been there before. Encouraged, he kept going. Soon, he began replacing his afternoon coffee with another cup of mango leaf tea, finding that it gave him a gentle energy without the jittery edge caffeine sometimes brought. It became a ritual. The quiet sound of the kettle, the swirl of steam as the leaves infused the water, the first sip that seemed to settle not just his body but his mind. Weeks passed, and Christopher began to notice other changes. His evening walks felt lighter, his breathing easier. The waistband of his trousers, which had been uncomfortably snug, began to give him a little more room. The fine lines on his face seemed softer, his skin clearer. His daughter remarked one day that his eyes looked brighter, more awake. It wasn't a transformation that happened overnight, nor was it the result of mango leaf tea alone. Christopher had also started paying closer attention to what he ate, moving more and sleeping better. But the tea had become a touchstone, a small daily reminder that he was taking steps toward healing. He began reading more about mango leaves, fascinated by the science behind them. Mangiferin, it turned out, was a powerful polyphenol that not only improved insulin sensitivity but also protected cells from damage. Quercetin, another compound in the leaves, was known for its anti-inflammatory and antioxidant properties. These weren't just vague health claims, there were studies, real evidence that suggested mango leaf tea could help in ways that aligned perfectly with his needs. And perhaps most importantly, it was something natural, gentle, and in harmony with the rest of his life. One morning, as Christopher sipped his tea by the window, watching the first blush of dawn touch the sky, he realized how far he had come from that chilly autumn morning when the diagnosis had shaken him. He no longer felt like a man waiting for illness to catch up with him. He felt instead like someone steering his own course, making deliberate choices that supported his health and well-being. The tea was no longer just a drink, it was a symbol of that choice, a quiet companion on his journey back to himself. And that's where I come in, sharing Christopher's story with you, not as a prescription or a promise, but as an invitation to look beyond the obvious, to explore the simple, natural things that can make a profound difference in how we feel, how we live, and how we age. Just as Christopher found his way to a cup of mango leaf tea, perhaps there's a small, gentle shift waiting for you too, one that could open the door to a healthier, more vibrant chapter of your own life. Christopher had always been a creature of habit. For as long as he could remember, mornings began with the same routine: the low hum of the kettle on the stove, the comforting aroma of freshly brewed coffee filling his small kitchen, and the familiar creak of the wooden chair as he settled down at the table. He would sip slowly, letting the warmth wake him, while the newspaper lay folded beside his plate of toast. But that winter, things had begun to feel different. His body was sluggish, as if it had lost its rhythm. Even after 2 cups of coffee, he found himself staring blankly at the crossword puzzle, the clues refusing to click. It wasn't just tiredness, it was as though his mornings no longer belonged to him. Then came the day Maria visited. She arrived with her usual cheer, wrapped in a knitted scarf that smelled faintly of lavender. "I've brought you something different today," she announced, setting a small cloth bag on the counter. When she loosened the drawstring, a fresh, earthy fragrance rose into the air. Inside were delicate, dark green leaves, still carrying the faint gloss of life. "Mango leaves," she explained, her voice softening. "Not the fruit, the leaves. My grandmother brewed these every morning back in Brazil." She didn't elaborate right away. Instead, she filled his kettle, dropped a handful of leaves into a pot, and poured the boiling water over them. The steam curled up like a secret waiting to be told. Christopher watched as the clear water deepened into a pale amber, the edges of the leaves swaying gently as though still alive. Maria poured the tea into a ceramic mug, the kind that felt solid and warm in the hand. "Go on," she urged. He lifted it to his lips, expecting something bitter, perhaps grassy, but was surprised. The taste was smooth, almost silky, with a hint of sweetness that lingered without clinging. It was unlike any tea he had ever tried, calming yet bright, familiar yet new. For the first time in months, he felt curious about what might come next. That first cup didn't change his life overnight, but there was something about it, the quiet ritual of steeping the leaves, the soft, grounding aroma that made him want to try it again the next day and the day after that. Soon he found himself reaching for the mango leaves instead of coffee each morning. The kettle still whistled, the chair still creaked, but the energy that greeted him was different. It was gentler, steadier, and it carried him into the day with a sense of ease he hadn't felt in a long while. Even the crossword puzzles began to make sense again, his mind less foggy, his hands steadier as he held the pen. One morning, about a week after starting this new routine, Christopher caught sight of himself in the hallway mirror. There was a softness in his expression he hadn't noticed before, a subtle ease around the eyes. His skin didn't look quite as tired, his shoulders didn't slump as much. It was such a small change, barely there, yet it mattered. It reminded him that maybe, just maybe, he was onto something, that a small, simple choice could ripple quietly through the rest of his day. He didn't tell many people about the tea at first. Part of him wanted to keep it private, almost like a secret pact between himself and the mornings. But when his daughter visited one Saturday, she noticed the absence of coffee. "No espresso today, Dad?" she asked, peeking into his mug. He smiled and shook his head. "Trying something new," he said simply. She raised an eyebrow but didn't press further. What he didn't tell her was that coffee had begun to leave him feeling jittery, his heart racing long after the cup was empty. The mango leaf tea was different. It woke him without rattling him, leaving his thoughts smooth instead of scattered. The more he drank it, the more he found himself looking forward to it, not just for the taste, but for the way it set the tone for his day. It wasn't only about what was in the cup, but about what it represented. A quiet choice to take care of himself, to begin each morning with something that nourished rather than taxed him. That choice, small as it seemed, was the first step towards something larger. He didn't know it yet, but the tea was more than a drink. It was the beginning of a journey. Christopher's earliest memory of mangoes wasn't from his own garden or even his own kitchen. It was from summers spent at his grandmother's house in the countryside. She had a towering mango tree in the backyard, its branches sprawling like a lazy green umbrella over the red-tiled roof. As a boy, he would spend hours beneath that tree, barefoot on the warm earth, watching the fruit sway gently in the breeze. The air always smelled faintly sweet, a perfume that mixed with the hum of bees and the rustle of leaves. His grandmother would call him inside in the late afternoon, her apron stained with juice, and hand him a thick slice of mango on a chipped porcelain plate. "Eat, Christopher," she would say, her eyes twinkling. "This will keep you strong." It was a memory that lived quietly in the back of his mind for decades, tucked away like a keepsake in a drawer he seldom opened. But that memory came rushing back the first week he began drinking mango leaf tea. It wasn't the taste that triggered it. The tea was gentler, earthier, but the scent. There was something in the steam rising from his cup that reminded him of those sun-drenched afternoons and his grandmother's voice. He found himself smiling at the thought, his morning suddenly richer for carrying a piece of that past into the present. Yet alongside these warm memories, there was the reality he was facing. His blood sugar was still on his mind, the doctor's words never far away. For years, he had managed to keep his health steady through sensible eating and regular walks, but now, the numbers told a different story. He had noticed the creeping signs even before the diagnosis, the heavier steps, the sudden thirst, the fatigue that clung like a damp coat. But he had chosen to believe they were just part of getting older. Now, he knew better. The problem was real, and it needed his attention. That's why, when Maria mentioned that mango leaves were used in Brazil to help keep blood sugar steady, Christopher listened more closely than he had to any other health tip in recent years. She explained that her grandmother had boiled the leaves not just for taste, but for what they could do inside the body, calming the spikes in blood sugar that could make a person tired, irritable, and eventually sick. Christopher didn't need convincing through charts or medical jargon. He trusted the quiet authority in Maria's voice, the way her story felt more like a gift than a lecture. The first sign of relief came quietly, almost without him realizing it. A few days into his new morning ritual, he noticed he wasn't getting that mid-morning crash that used to send him to the kitchen for another cup of coffee or a biscuit. His energy no longer rose and fell like a wave. It held steady, carrying him through to lunchtime without the usual hunger pangs or foggy thinking. He began to wonder if the tea was playing a role in this change, but he didn't want to jump to conclusions. Still, it was enough to make him curious, and hope was a good enough reason to keep going. The difference became even clearer a couple of weeks later when Christopher visited his daughter and her family. They had spent the afternoon in the park, his grandchildren running ahead on the path while he followed at a steady pace. Normally, he would be looking for a bench after 10 or 15 minutes, pretending to admire the scenery while catching his breath. But that day, he realized he hadn't stopped once. He wasn't winded. His legs felt lighter, and he could keep pace with the children without forcing himself. His daughter noticed too. "You seem different, Dad," she said as they headed back to the car. "More energy. What have you been doing?" Christopher just smiled, patting the thermos in his bag. "Nothing much," he replied. "Just changing how I start my mornings." And there was also a shift in the way he thought about food. Drinking the tea seemed to set the tone for making better choices throughout the day. It wasn't that he suddenly craved salads or swore off bread, but he found himself naturally leaning toward lighter meals and fewer sweets. The sharp cravings that used to pull him toward sugary snacks were softer now, easier to resist. It was as if that first cup of tea in the morning was a small promise he made to himself. A promise to keep things steady, to care for his body the way his grandmother had cared for his as a boy. Still, Christopher knew he couldn't just rely on tea alone. He had a follow-up appointment with his doctor in a few weeks, and he wanted to see real progress. So he combined his tea ritual with a little more walking, stretching in the mornings, and keeping a closer eye on his portion sizes. It wasn't about restriction or punishment, it was about balance. the kind his grandmother had always lived by without ever naming it. And with each passing day, he felt that balance returning, not just in his body, but in his outlook. One afternoon, as he sat by the kitchen window sipping his tea, he thought about how small changes can ripple out into something much bigger. If Maria hadn't brought him those leaves, if he hadn't been willing to try them, he might still be dragging himself through his days, resigned to feeling worse with time. Instead, he felt a quiet momentum building, the sense that he was moving towards something better. And for the first time in a long while, he believed that improvement was possible. The memories of his grandmother's mango tree now felt like more than just nostalgia. They were a reminder that health wasn't always about big interventions or complicated treatments. Sometimes it was about returning to something simple, something rooted in tradition and nature, something that connected the present to the past in a way that felt both comforting and hopeful. For Christopher, mango leaf tea had become that bridge, linking a boy's carefree afternoons in the shade of a tree to a man's quiet determination to keep his health and independence. As he finished the last sip and set the empty cup in the sink, Christopher realized the relief he felt wasn't just from steadier blood sugar or lighter steps. It was from knowing that he wasn't powerless, that he could still make choices that mattered, that even at 62 there was room for change, and that change could begin with something as humble as the leaves from a mango tree. By the third week of drinking mango leaf tea every morning, Christopher had begun to notice patterns, small, subtle changes that were easy to miss unless you were paying attention. And he was paying attention. The first sign came when he realized that the afternoon fatigue that had once been a faithful visitor was now a rare occurrence. He wasn't dragging himself to the armchair at 2 o'clock, hoping to close his eyes for just a few minutes that often turned into an unplanned nap. His days were steadier, his mind clearer. There was a smoothness to the way his energy carried him from morning until night, and he couldn't help but suspect that the tea was playing a part. The real test came at his next doctor's appointment. Christopher walked into the clinic with a quiet mix of hope and caution. He had learned over the years not to pin all his expectations on a single moment, but this one mattered. The nurse took his blood pressure, his weight, and then pricked his finger for a quick glucose test. As she read the number, she glanced up at him. "This is better than last time," she said, smiling. It wasn't a dramatic change, but it was a real one. His blood sugar had dropped enough for his doctor to notice, enough to confirm that something he was doing was working. When the doctor asked if he had made any changes, Christopher explained about the tea. The doctor raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "I've read a few studies on mangiferin," she said. "It's a polyphenol found in mango leaves. Some research suggests it helps improve how the body uses insulin, making it easier for cells to absorb glucose." She went on to explain that mangiferin might also slow the release of sugar from the liver into the blood, which could help keep blood sugar levels more stable throughout the day. Christopher listened carefully, surprised to hear his quiet little habit backed by science. It was one thing to trust Maria's stories, but another to hear a medical professional explain why it might actually work. What struck him most, though, was how simple it all was. No complicated meal plans, no expensive supplements, no crash diets, just a few fresh leaves boiled in water each morning. Of course, he knew it wasn't magic. The tea worked best alongside other sensible habits, eating more vegetables, walking after meals, keeping stress in check. But the fact that something so small could make such a difference gave him a sense of control he hadn't felt in months. He didn't have to overhaul his entire life overnight. He just had to keep doing the small things that worked. At home, Christopher began to treat his tea-making ritual with even more care. He would choose the freshest leaves, rinse them gently, and let them dry slightly before dropping them into the pot. He liked to watch the water change color, the way the leaves swayed like slow dancers in the heat. As the aroma filled his kitchen, he found himself breathing more deeply, his shoulders loosening. It was a pause in his day that belonged entirely to him. No screens, no noise, just the quiet act of brewing something good for his body. One Saturday morning, his grandson Daniel wandered into the kitchen while Christopher was making tea. "What's that smell?" the boy asked, peering over the counter. "Mango leaves," Christopher replied, pouring the tea into his favorite mug. "Want a smell?" Daniel took a cautious sniff, wrinkled his nose, then grinned. "Smells kinda sweet, but weird," Christopher chuckled. "That's how you know it's good for you." He told Daniel about the mango tree from his childhood, about how the leaves were more than just decoration. They were medicine, tradition, and nourishment all in one. The boy listened, wide-eyed, as if his grandfather had just told him a secret. The more Christopher shared his experience, the more he realized how few people knew about mango leaf tea. Friends at his weekly chess club would ask how he was feeling, and he would tell them about his steadier energy, his better glucose readings. At first, they teased him. "What's next, Christopher? Dandelion soup?" But after a few weeks, one of them quietly asked if he could try some leaves too. Christopher smiled and agreed. It felt good to pass on something that was working for him, the way Maria had done for him. There were still challenges, of course. Some days, old habits whispered to him, the lure of a strong coffee first thing in the morning, the easy comfort of a pastry with his tea. But he noticed that when he started the day with mango leaf tea, those whispers were easier to ignore. It was as if the tea didn't just steady his blood sugar, but his resolve as well. The physical steadiness made it easier to choose well in other parts of his life. He also began to sleep better. That surprised him the most. He had expected more stable energy, maybe better digestion, but not deeper, more restful sleep. Yet most nights now, he drifted off easily and stayed asleep until morning. He wondered if it was because his blood sugar was more balanced, or if the evening cup of tea he sometimes enjoyed was helping his body relax. Either way, he wasn't about to argue with the results. One evening, Christopher sat with Maria on her back porch, each of them cradling a mug of steaming tea. The sun was setting, painting the sky in streaks of gold and rose. "You were right," he said quietly. "This tea, it's done more for me than I expected." Maria smiled knowingly. "Sometimes the best medicine is the simplest," she said, "and the best changes start small." They sipped in companionable silence, the fading light wrapping around them like a soft blanket. Christopher knew there would still be days when his health felt like work, days when the numbers on his glucose monitor might creep higher, when old cravings might return. But now he had something he hadn't before, a tool, a habit, a quiet secret in a cup that helped him fight back. He didn't feel at the mercy of his condition anymore. He felt like a man taking small, deliberate steps toward the life he wanted to keep living. And every morning, when he lifted that cup to his lips, he remembered the lesson. Sometimes the smallest rituals can change the course of a day and a life. For as long as Christopher could remember, sleep had been a tricky thing. It wasn't that he couldn't fall asleep. Most nights, drifting off came easily enough. The problem was staying asleep. Somewhere between 2 and 3 in the morning, he would wake, his mind oddly alert, replaying conversations from years ago or ticking through the next day's errands. He would lie there for an hour or more, watching the ceiling fade from shadow to pale gray as dawn approached. And by the time he finally drifted off again, it was almost time to wake. This broken sleep had been a quiet thief in his life, stealing energy from his mornings, patience from his afternoons, and joy from his evenings. Even when he told himself he was used to it, the fatigue showed in his face, in the slight slump of his shoulders, and in the way he sometimes forgot small things. The doctor had suggested all the usual remedies: cutting caffeine, keeping the bedroom cool, limiting screen time before bed. Christopher had tried them all, and while they helped a little, nothing truly fixed the problem. It wasn't until one particularly restless night, when he finally gave up at 4 in the morning and made himself a cup of mango leaf tea, that he realized the tea might hold another benefit he hadn't considered. The warm, earthy steam rose in slow curls, and the first sip settled something deep inside him. It wasn't dramatic, but it was enough. He sat in the dim kitchen, listening to the quiet hum of the refrigerator, feeling his heart slow, his breathing deepen. By the time the cup was empty, he felt ready to try sleep again. And to his surprise, he drifted off within minutes and slept soundly until his alarm went off. The next night, he tried again, this time brewing the tea deliberately about an hour before bed. He kept the lights low, left his phone in the other room, and sat by the living room window where the moonlight spilled across the floor. He sipped slowly, savoring the warmth, the gentle sweetness, the way it seemed to smooth out the sharp edges of his thoughts. When he went to bed, he fell asleep quickly and, more importantly, stayed asleep. It was the kind of deep, unbroken rest he hadn't felt in years. He mentioned it to Maria a few days later when they met for their usual Saturday morning walk. She nodded knowingly. "My grandmother used to drink mango leaf tea at night too," she said. She swore it kept her heart calm and her dreams peaceful. Maria explained that while she wasn't a scientist, she had read that the antioxidants and certain plant compounds in mango leaves might help relax blood vessels, reduce inflammation, and calm the nervous system. "It's like it tells your body, you can rest now," she said. Christopher wasn't one to leap to conclusions, but he couldn't deny the pattern. When he had his tea in the evening, he slept better. When he skipped it, his old restless nights crept back in. He decided to make it part of his nightly routine, a small, comforting ritual that told both his mind and his body that it was time to wind down. His daughter noticed the change after a few weeks. "You look different, Dad," she said one Sunday afternoon over lunch. "More rested, like you've been on vacation," he laughed. "No vacation," he said, "just better nights." She raised an eyebrow. "You finally listened to the doctor and started meditating?" "Something like that," Christopher replied, smiling into his cup. It wasn't just the sleep itself that made a difference. It was what better sleep gave back to him. His mornings felt brighter, less like a slow climb out of a fog. He had more energy for his walks, more patience when helping Daniel with his school projects, more focus when reading. Even small irritations, a sudden rainstorm, a slow line at the grocery store, didn't get under his skin the way they used to. Rest had given him back his temperance, and with it, a certain joy. One night, after an unusually long and busy day, Christopher brewed his tea and sat by the window, watching the streetlights flicker on one by one. He thought about how, just a few months earlier, he would have been bracing himself for another night of staring at the ceiling. Now he felt calm, almost grateful for the quiet ahead. The tea was warm in his hands, the world outside was still, and inside, he felt a gentle sense of ease. It was a small thing, a cup of tea, but it had shifted something important in his life. It reminded him of a story his grandmother used to tell him about how her own father had come home from long days in the fields and always taken a few minutes to sit quietly with a warm drink before bed. It was his way of leaving the day behind, she had said, so he wouldn't take the weight of it into his dreams. Christopher smiled at the memory. Perhaps he was finally learning to do the same. By the end of that month, his sleep journal, something his doctor had once suggested he keep, looked entirely different. The restless nights were fewer and farther between, the stretches of unbroken sleep longer. He no longer dreaded bedtime, and he no longer woke feeling like the night had only been half a rest. For the first time in years, his days began with the kind of energy that made living feel easier, lighter. It wasn't a miracle cure, and Christopher knew that. There would still be nights when sleep might elude him, too much excitement, a noisy storm, the occasional late-night worry. But he had found something he could lean on, something that helped more often than not, and that was enough. The tea had given him back his nights, and with them, a better version of his days. And so, each evening, without fail, he would set the kettle on the stove, drop the leaves into the pot, and let their gentle fragrance fill the kitchen. It was his way of telling the day it was done, of welcoming the night with open hands, and every time he lifted that cup, he felt the quiet promise it carried. Rest is here, and it is yours. Christopher had always thought of energy as something you either had or you didn't, like waking up to find your favorite coffee already brewed or realizing the pantry was empty. Some mornings you rose ready to take on the day, other mornings you simply didn't. But over the last decade, he had gotten used to running on what felt like half a tank. Even on good days, there was a heaviness in his limbs, a slow start in his mind. He moved through life as though walking through water, deliberate but weighed down. When the doctor had warned him about his rising blood sugar, it made sense. The fatigue, the brain fog, the way afternoons stretched into gray, it was all part of the picture. But knowing the cause didn't necessarily hand him a solution. That's why the changes he was beginning to notice now felt so surprising. It wasn't just that he could walk farther or sleep better, it was that the days themselves seemed brighter and his thoughts clearer. It happened in small, almost invisible steps. He would be halfway through his morning crossword before realizing he hadn't once paused to remember what he was doing. He could head out for a walk and notice the world around him instead of staring at the pavement, willing his legs to keep moving. Conversations with his daughter no longer required him to fight through a haze to follow her train of thought. Even his sense of humor seemed to have woken up. Little jokes and observations came more easily, and he found himself laughing more often. Christopher wasn't naive enough to think a single habit could fix everything, but he also couldn't ignore the connection. His morning tea ritual had become more than a beverage. It was like setting the tone for the entire day. The warm, steady lift it gave him wasn't a jolt, the way coffee sometimes did. It was more like the slow unfurling of sunlight through the blinds. Gentle, certain, unhurried. One afternoon, while sitting with Maria on her porch, he mentioned the change. "It's the strangest thing," he said. "I feel lighter, not just in my body, but up here." He tapped the side of his head. Maria smiled knowingly. "When your blood sugar is more stable, your mind thanks you," she said. "It's not working overtime to deal with the spikes and crashes." She explained that high blood sugar could affect concentration, memory, even mood. If the tea was helping keep those numbers in check, it made sense his mind would feel sharper. Christopher thought about how often he used to lose track of simple things, walking into a room and forgetting why, setting down his glasses and spending 20 minutes hunting for them. It had been frustrating, a reminder that he wasn't as quick as he used to be. But lately, those moments were fewer. His thoughts seemed to flow more easily, and even when he did misplace something, he could backtrack with ease. The fog was lifting. It wasn't just mental clarity either. There was a buoyancy in his step he hadn't felt in years. His morning walks were longer now, sometimes stretching into the nearby park where he would sit for a while, listening to the chatter of birds and the rustle of leaves. He noticed the way sunlight played on the water, the sharp scent of pine in the air after rain. Before, he might have passed these things without a second glance. Now they felt like gifts waiting to be noticed. Daniel picked up on the change, too. One Saturday, the boy challenged his grandfather to a game of tag in the yard. Christopher laughed, ready to decline, but something in him said, "Why not?" To his own surprise, he chased Daniel around for a good 10 minutes before needing to catch his breath. When they finally collapsed onto the grass, both laughing, Daniel grinned. "You're faster than you look, Grandpa." Christopher grinned back, a little out of breath but proud. That playful moment would have been unthinkable just a couple of months ago. He began to see how closely his body and mind were connected. When his energy was low, everything else suffered: patience, creativity, focus. But when his body felt lighter, his mind followed. He thought of the mango leaves steeping in his kitchen each morning, their quiet work seeping into his day like roots nourishing a tree. It wasn't a rush, it wasn't dramatic, but it was steady, and that steadiness was what he had been missing. One evening, as he sat with his tea and a book, Christopher reflected on how easily he could have missed this. If Maria hadn't shared her grandmother's wisdom, if he hadn't been willing to try, he might still be moving through life in a haze. Now he felt like he had reclaimed a part of himself he thought was gone for good. The quickness in his thoughts, the ease in his steps, the ability to laugh and play, these weren't just nice improvements. They were pieces of his life returned to him. It wasn't about becoming a new person, it was about becoming himself again. The Christopher who used to wake early, tend his garden with purpose, chat easily with neighbors, and still have the energy to read a book at night. The man who didn't just get through the day, but lived it. He decided to keep a small notebook on the kitchen counter, jotting down each time he noticed one of these little changes. Walked to the park without stopping. Finished the crossword before breakfast. Played tag with Daniel. Seeing the list grow gave him a sense of momentum, a reminder that progress didn't have to be loud or dramatic to matter. Maria noticed the notebook one afternoon and flipped through it with a smile. "These are victories," she said. "Don't underestimate them." Christopher nodded. He realized that before the tea, he hadn't been looking for victories at all. He had been expecting decline, waiting for the next reminder that he was getting older. Now he was collecting reminders that he was still very much alive. And so, each morning, when the water boiled and the leaves began to release their gentle fragrance, Christopher felt more than anticipation for his first sip. He felt gratitude for Maria, for his grandmother's mango tree, for the small rituals that had given him back not just energy, but clarity, presence, and a renewed joy in the simple moments that made up his days. The last time Christopher had sat in his doctor's office, he remembered feeling a quiet dread. That was months ago. The day he had first been told his blood sugar was high enough to put him on the doorstep of diabetes. The memory was still fresh, the paper crinkling under him on the exam table, the sterile smell of antiseptic, the weight in his chest as the doctor gently explained what it all meant. That day, he'd gone home thinking his body was slipping out of his control. Now, as he pushed open the glass door to the clinic, the feeling was entirely different. There was a spring in his step, an undercurrent of confidence he hadn't felt in years. He'd been drinking mango leaf tea every morning, and more recently, most evenings too. He had been walking more, eating a little lighter, sleeping better. He didn't expect miracles, but he knew, deep down, that something was working. The nurse greeted him with a familiar smile. "Morning, Christopher," she said, ushering him toward the chair for his blood draw. He rolled up his sleeve, making light conversation as she tied the elastic band around his arm. He'd done this enough times to know it only took a few minutes for the results to appear in the system. The wait was always the hardest part. When the doctor came in, she carried a small folder, flipping it open as she sat down. "Well," she began, "you've been busy." Her tone had a spark to it, the kind that made Christopher lean forward. She turned the folder toward him so he could see the chart. There, in clean black numbers, was the proof. His fasting blood sugar had dropped significantly, enough to pull him out of the danger zone. His A1C, the number that reflects average blood sugar over the last 3 months, had improved more than she expected. Christopher felt a quiet rush of pride. "So, no medication yet?" he asked. The doctor smiled. "Not if you keep this up. Whatever you've been doing, it's working." He told her about the mango leaf tea, how Maria had introduced him to it, and how it had become a cornerstone of his days. She leaned back in her chair, intrigued. "I've read about mangiferin and quercetin," she said. "They've shown promise in research, helping with insulin sensitivity, reducing oxidative stress. It's not a substitute for a healthy lifestyle, but it could be a helpful piece of the puzzle. In your case, I'd say it's a very good piece." Her words settled in his chest like a warm ember. For months, Christopher had been quietly working at this, brewing tea, walking in the park, resisting the easy pull of old habits. There had been no big announcement, no dramatic before and after moment, but here, in black and white, was the result of all those small, steady choices. As he left the clinic, he thought about how easy it would have been to dismiss the tea as just another home remedy. If he had, he might still be sitting in that office with numbers moving in the wrong direction. Instead, he had given it a chance, and in doing so, had given himself one too. Back at home, he called Maria to share the news. "Your grandmother would be proud," he told her, his voice warm. Maria laughed. "I think she'd say, 'Good, now keep going.'" They both knew this wasn't the finish line. Health wasn't something you fixed once and forgot about. It was something you tended to, like a garden. And just as a garden thrived with regular care, so did the body. That evening, he brewed his tea with even more care than usual. The leaves swirled in the hot water, releasing their fragrance, and he thought about the quiet power they carried, not just in their nutrients, but in what they represented. They were a daily act of hope, a reminder that change didn't have to be loud or sudden to be real. When his daughter came by the next day, he showed her the results. She hugged him tightly. "I'm proud of you, Dad," she said. "You've really turned things around." He grinned. "1 cup at a time," he replied. She glanced at the kettle on the stove and laughed. "Guess I'd better start drinking it too." Over the next few weeks, Christopher noticed something else. It wasn't just that he felt better physically, though that was true. It was that he trusted himself again. He trusted his ability to make choices that mattered, to follow through on them, to steer his own ship. The numbers on the page had given him more than good news. They had given him back his confidence. And so, each morning, he kept the ritual alive. The kettle sang, the leaves steeped, the steam curled upward like a quiet blessing. He drank slowly, not rushing the moment, letting it remind him that the path he was on was worth staying on. There would be other checkups, other numbers to watch, but for now, he carried the quiet satisfaction of knowing he had turned a corner. It wasn't a miracle. It was something better. The steady, proven reward of showing up for himself every single day. And that, he thought, was worth every leaf in the pot. Christopher had a habit of keeping old clothes longer than most people thought reasonable. His daughter often teased him about it, pointing to the neatly folded stacks in his wardrobe. "Dad, some of these shirts are older than me," she'd say with a laugh. But for him, clothes weren't just fabric, they were memories stitched into seams. There was the jacket he'd worn to his retirement party, the sweater his late wife had knitted during their first winter together, and, tucked at the back of the bottom drawer, the jeans he used to wear on Sunday mornings when he went to the farmer's market. Those jeans hadn't seen daylight in years. He'd stopped wearing them when the waistband began to pinch uncomfortably, a quiet but undeniable reminder that his body had changed. At first, he told himself it was just a matter of comfort, that newer jeans had softer denim and more forgiving cuts. But the truth was simpler. They didn't fit anymore, and forcing them on felt like a small defeat. So they stayed folded, gathering the faint scent of cedar from the wardrobe. One afternoon, about 2 months into his mango leaf tea habit, Christopher was tidying up when he came across that old pair. He picked them up and turned them over in his hands, remembering how they used to feel. Snug but easy, worn in just enough to move with him. On a whim, he decided to try them on. He wasn't expecting much. After all, weight loss hadn't been his primary goal when he started drinking the tea. But as he slid one leg in, then the other, something unexpected happened. The denim didn't fight him. When he pulled them up and fastened the button, he realized they fit. Not just barely, but comfortably. He stood there for a moment, almost laughing in disbelief. He turned from side to side, checking the fit in the mirror. They looked good, better than he remembered. He could even slide a hand between the waistband and his shirt without feeling it catch. It wasn't a dramatic transformation, but it was enough to make him feel lighter, not just in body, but in spirit. That evening, when Maria stopped by for tea, he told her the story. "You know," he said, grinning, "I think this tea has been working harder than I realized." She tilted her head. "You've been walking more too," she reminded him, "and eating a little better. But yes, mango leaf tea can help with that. When your blood sugar is steady, your body is less likely to store excess sugar as fat. Plus, mangiferin can give your metabolism a gentle push." She sipped her tea and added, "It's not magic, but it's good science." Christopher nodded. He didn't need magic. What he needed, what he valued most, was something that worked quietly, steadily, without turning his life upside down. He thought about the old days when he'd tried to lose a few pounds with fad diets or intense exercise programs. They had worked for a while, but they never lasted. This felt different. He hadn't been depriving himself or chasing unrealistic goals. He had simply changed a few daily habits, and the results had crept in almost unnoticed. It wasn't just about the jeans. He felt lighter when he moved. Walking up the small hill to the park didn't leave him winded. Bending down to weed the garden didn't make him groan quite as much when he stood up. Even his shoes felt looser, as if his feet had shed some of their own burden. The changes were subtle, but they added up to something meaningful. A week later, his daughter noticed. She dropped by unexpectedly and found him in the kitchen wearing the jeans. "Wait a minute," she said, eyes narrowing playfully. "Are those the jeans you swore you'd never fit into again?" He chuckled. "They are," he admitted. She looked him over and shook her head with a smile. "You look good, Dad. Healthy." Her words warmed him more than he expected. It wasn't vanity. It was the quiet satisfaction of knowing he was moving in the right direction. That night, as he brewed his evening tea, Christopher thought about how often we overlook the small victories in life. We set our sights on big, sweeping changes and forget that the smallest signs, an old pair of jeans fitting, a hill climbed without stopping, can be just as powerful. These victories might not make headlines, but they can change the way you see yourself. And for him, that shift was everything. The next weekend, he wore the jeans to the farmer's market for the first time in years. The air was crisp, filled with the scent of fresh bread and herbs. He strolled between the stalls, filling his basket with ripe tomatoes, a loaf of crusty bread, and a bundle of mint for his tea. A few familiar vendors greeted him warmly, noting he looked well or younger somehow. He didn't tell them about the mango leaves. Some things felt better kept as quiet triumphs. Still, he couldn't help but feel a little proud as he walked home, the jeans fitting just right, the basket swinging from his arm. It wasn't about turning back time, it was about feeling comfortable in his own skin again. About having proof that his choices, as small as they sometimes seemed, were making a difference. Later that afternoon, as he sat by the window with his tea, he thought about how far he'd come from the day he first heard his doctor's warning. Back then, he had felt the weight of inevitability pressing down on him, the sense that decline was a one-way road. Now he knew better. The road had forks, choices, turns, and sometimes all it took to start in a new direction was a single, simple habit. The old jeans were just a pair of denim, but to Christopher, they were also a reminder of who he had been, of who he still could be, and of the quiet, steady power of taking care of himself one day at a time. Christopher had always thought of detox as a trendy word people used to sell expensive juice cleanses. It conjured images of chalky green drinks in tall plastic bottles and promises that sounded too good to be true. He'd never been one for quick fixes, and so he dismissed the idea almost entirely, until he began drinking mango leaf tea every day. It started with something subtle. A couple of weeks after making the tea part of his routine, he noticed he was visiting the bathroom more often, not in an uncomfortable or urgent way, but in a steady, regular rhythm his body seemed to welcome. There was a lightness in his belly, a sense that his system was moving the way it should. It was as if his body had been holding on to things it no longer needed. And now, slowly and quietly, it was letting them go. Maria had mentioned once that mango leaf tea was a natural diuretic, gentle enough not to deplete the body, but strong enough to help flush out excess fluid and waste. "It's like giving your insides a little housekeeping," she'd said with a smile. At the time, Christopher had nodded politely without thinking much of it. Now he understood. His skin looked clearer, the puffiness around his eyes in the mornings had softened, and he was waking up with a sense of refreshment that went beyond sleep. One particularly warm afternoon, after a walk by the river, Christopher poured himself a tall glass of cooled mango leaf tea over ice. The first sip was crisp and clean, almost as if it cut through the heat. As he sat on the porch, watching the sun glint on the water, he realized that drinking the tea had become more than a health habit. It was a way of caring for himself from the inside out. Every cup felt like a quiet investment in how he wanted to feel tomorrow, next week, even years from now. There was a day, not long after, when he truly felt the difference. His daughter had invited him over to help reorganize her garage, a task that, in the past, might have left him feeling drained and sluggish halfway through. But this time, he worked steadily, lifting boxes, sweeping corners, and climbing the small stepladder to reach the higher shelves. He didn't feel the heaviness in his limbs that he used to. He didn't have to stop every few minutes to catch his breath. When they finished, he was tired, but it was the good kind of tired, the kind that comes from work well done, not from a body struggling to keep up. That night, over dinner, his daughter remarked, "You've got more energy these days, Dad. You didn't even complain once about your back." Christopher laughed. "Maybe I'm just out of practice with complaining," he teased. But he knew it was more than that. His body felt freer, less burdened by the sluggishness that used to hang over him. He began to notice other little changes, too. His digestion seemed smoother, his appetite more balanced. Foods that once made him feel heavy or bloated didn't seem to have the same effect, especially when he paired them with his tea throughout the day. He even found himself craving lighter meals, crisp salads, grilled fish, fresh fruit, as if his body was aligning itself with the cleaner, lighter feeling the tea gave him. One Sunday afternoon, Christopher and Maria sat in her garden, mugs in hand. He told her how different he felt, how it was more than just less tired or a little lighter. It was as though a fog had lifted from the inside, leaving him more awake, more himself. Maria nodded knowingly. "When you help your body let go of what it doesn't need," she said, "you make space for it to work the way it's meant to." Her words stayed with him. That evening, as he prepared his nightly tea, he thought about how many years he had carried small burdens without even realizing it, not just in his body, but in his mind. The weight of unchecked habits, the drag of fatigue, the acceptance of feeling just okay instead of truly well. Now, with every cup, he was slowly letting some of that go. It wasn't dramatic, there was no overnight transformation. But one morning, as he stood in front of the mirror, he noticed something that made him smile. His posture was straighter, his face a little brighter. He felt, for lack of a better word, renewed. And the best part was knowing that this wasn't the result of anything extreme or punishing. It came from a simple ritual he enjoyed, one that fit seamlessly into his days. The next time he visited his doctor, she commented on his improved complexion and the healthy tone in his skin. "Whatever you're doing, keep it up," she said. Christopher nodded, resisting the urge to grin too widely. He didn't feel the need to launch into a speech about mango leaves. It was enough to know that it was working quietly in the background, keeping his body clean, light, and ready for what each day brought. That night, sitting on his porch as the crickets began their evening song, Christopher sipped his tea slowly, feeling the cool air settle on his skin. He thought about the word reborn, how it sounded dramatic when used in advertisements or grand speeches. But in his own quiet way, that's exactly how he felt. Not transformed into someone new, but returned to the best version of himself. Freed from the extra weight, the sluggishness, the little discomforts he had once thought were just part of getting older. As he finished the last sip, he set the cup down with a deep sense of gratitude. The tea had become more than a drink. It was a companion in his journey, a reminder that even the simplest choices could clear a path toward feeling alive again. Christopher had never been the kind of man to fuss over his skin. Shaving cream, a bar of soap, and the occasional splash of aftershave had been the extent of his routine for most of his life. Wrinkles, he thought, were simply part of living, marks of years well spent. But as the years had gone by, he couldn't help but notice the changes. His skin had grown drier, Fine lines had deepened into creases, and there was a certain dullness that even his daughter, once without malice, had described as tired. It didn't bother him enough to seek out creams or treatments. But somewhere in the quiet of those early tea-drinking mornings, something began to shift. It wasn't overnight, nothing in his life ever had been. But slowly, almost imperceptibly, his skin began to change. He first noticed it while shaving one morning. The razor glided more easily, and when he rinsed his face, the skin beneath felt smoother. The dryness that once left his cheeks feeling tight was softer now, more supple. A few days later, at the grocery store, an old neighbor stopped him in the produce aisle. "You look well," she said, tilting her head as if trying to place exactly what was different. "Have you been on vacation?" He smiled politely, but the truth was simpler. No trips, no spa visits, just his quiet ritual of mango leaf tea. It was Maria who connected the dots for him. One afternoon, as they sat in her garden sipping tea, she mentioned that mango leaves were rich in vitamin C and antioxidants. "They help your body make collagen," she explained. "That's the protein that keeps your skin firm and elastic. And the antioxidants protect your skin from damage, like tiny shields." Christopher chuckled. "So you're telling me I've been giving myself a facelift in a teacup?" She laughed. "Something like that." The more he thought about it, the more it made sense. The tea wasn't just helping inside his body, regulating blood sugar, improving his energy. It was working on the outside too. His skin tone looked more even, the blotchiness that had sometimes appeared on his cheeks had softened, and there was a brightness in his face that he hadn't seen in years. His daughter noticed next. One Sunday lunch, she studied him across the table, her brow furrowed. "You look different," she said slowly. "You look younger." Christopher laughed. "I'll take that as a compliment." She leaned forward. "No, really, your skin looks better, less dry, more color." He shrugged, pretending to be casual, but inside he felt a quiet surge of pride. What struck him most was how these changes affected more than his reflection. There was a confidence that came with looking healthier, a way of meeting people's eyes more easily, smiling more readily. It wasn't vanity, it was the reassurance that he was still vibrant, still present in his own life. The improvement in his skin seemed to mirror the way he felt inside. Just as the dullness had lifted from his complexion, so had the heaviness that once clouded his days. He walked taller, moved with more ease, and even found himself lingering in conversation with strangers, as if he had more energy to give to the world around him. One morning, while walking through the park, Christopher stopped to sit on a bench near the pond. The early sunlight was soft, the kind that seems to touch everything with gold. He caught his reflection in the still water and paused. He didn't see a man trying to look younger. He saw a man who looked exactly as he should for his years, but alive in a way he hadn't in some time. His skin wasn't flawless, but it was healthier, and that health radiated in a way no cream or serum could match. He began to appreciate the simple truth that when you care for your body from the inside, it shows on the outside. The tea had given him more than smoother skin. It had given him a reminder that health isn't something you paint on. It's something you grow, sip by sip, day by day. When he mentioned all this to his doctor at his next appointment, she nodded knowingly. Good skin is often a sign of good circulation, lower inflammation, and proper hydration, she said. If the tea is helping in those areas, it makes sense that your skin would benefit too. She added that lowering blood sugar levels could also reduce the production of compounds that age the skin prematurely. It was the first time Christopher had thought of his skin as a kind of reflection of his overall health. The realization made him even more committed to his routine. Morning or evening, whether the day was rushed or relaxed, he made time for his tea. And each time he lifted the cup, he thought of it not just as a drink, but as a quiet investment in both the life he was living now and the years still ahead of him. It wasn't about turning back the clock. It was about letting himself age with vitality, with the kind of health that showed in his step, his smile, and yes, even in his skin. And that, Christopher decided, was the kind of youthfulness worth keeping. Cancer had always been a shadow in Christopher's mind, not the kind that loomed constantly, but the kind that lingered quietly in the background, waiting for a moment to make itself known. His father had died from prostate cancer in his late 70s, and Christopher still remembered the months of hospital visits, the hushed conversations in the kitchen, the way strength seemed to drain from a man who had once been unshakable. That memory had left a mark. For years, whenever Christopher heard about someone receiving a cancer diagnosis, his mind would drift back to those days, and the same quiet question would echo inside him. Could it happen to me? It wasn't just fear of the illness itself, it was fear of losing control, of his body turning against him without warning. He tried not to dwell on it, telling himself that worry wouldn't change anything, but still, it was there. That low, unspoken anxiety that sometimes came when he woke in the middle of the night, staring into the dark. One afternoon, while enjoying tea with Maria, the conversation drifted toward family health histories. She told him her grandmother had lived well into her 90s, strong and active until the very end. She always said her tea kept her healthy, Maria added with a smile. Christopher chuckled. I'm starting to believe her. That's when she mentioned something he didn't know. Mango leaves were rich in compounds like quercetin, mangiferin, and catechins, which had been studied for their potential to reduce the growth of cancer cells. Some research even suggested they could help the body naturally trigger the process of apoptosis, the programmed death of damaged cells. At first, Christopher listened politely, but then he found himself leaning forward. You mean this tea might actually help protect me? Maria nodded gently. It's not a magic cure, she said, but it's one more way to give your body the tools it needs to fight back, and a strong body can stand a better chance. She spoke not as someone selling hope, but as someone sharing something that had been passed down with care and belief. That night, Christopher couldn't stop thinking about it. The idea that he wasn't completely powerless, that there were things he could do every single day to strengthen his defenses, shifted something inside him. He realized that his old way of thinking, of waiting for illness to strike, had left him feeling vulnerable. But now he saw there was another way, to live in a way that prepared his body to fight should it ever be tested. Over the following weeks, his tea ritual took on a deeper meaning. It wasn't just about managing his blood sugar or sleeping better. Every cup felt like a quiet act of protection, a way of telling himself, I am doing what I can. He began pairing the tea with more colorful vegetables, fresh berries, and oily fish rich in omega-3s. These changes didn't feel like restrictions, they felt like armor slowly being built from the inside out. The fear didn't vanish overnight, but it softened. He noticed it most when he went for his routine checkups. Before, walking into the doctor's office had always carried a faint weight of dread. Now, while he still respected the possibility of bad news, he didn't feel entirely at the mercy of fate. He had changed the way he lived, and that gave him confidence, the kind that comes not from hoping for the best, but from knowing you're preparing for it. One spring morning, Christopher attended a neighborhood health fair. There was a table set up by a local nutritionist who spoke about cancer prevention through diet and lifestyle. She echoed much of what Maria had told him: reduce processed foods, keep sugar in check, eat plants in all colors, and embrace herbs and teas rich in antioxidants. As Christopher listened, he smiled quietly to himself. For once, he realized he was already doing many of these things without forcing himself into a rigid plan. The tea had been his gateway, the small daily choice that had led naturally to bigger ones. Back home that evening, he brewed his tea and sat by the open kitchen window, watching the early flowers sway in the breeze. He thought of his father, of the strength he'd once had, and of the helplessness that had come at the end. Christopher didn't know what his own future held. No one did. But he did know this: he wasn't waiting passively for whatever might come. He was living in a way that gave him the best chance possible. It struck him how liberating that was. Fear had a way of stealing joy from the present moment, of making you live in anticipation of what might go wrong. But when you turn that fear into action, even something as simple as brewing a pot of tea, it lost some of its power. You could breathe a little deeper. You could look toward tomorrow without flinching. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky in gold and rose, Christopher poured his tea into his favorite mug, the one with the tiny chip on the rim. He held it in both hands, feeling the warmth seep into his palms. It wasn't just tea, it was a reminder that his health was not an accident, but a series of choices made every day. And that was something worth holding on to. For the first time in years, the thought of cancer no longer felt like a looming shadow. It was still there in the distance, but it no longer defined how he saw his future. He had taken back some measure of control, and in doing so, had given himself the gift of peace. The fear had been replaced by something far more powerful, a quiet, steady confidence that he could meet whatever came with strength. For weeks, Christopher had been quietly making changes, drinking mango leaf tea morning and evening, walking a little farther each day, paying more attention to what he ate. To him, it had been a gradual shift, one small step at a time. He wasn't keeping score or measuring inches. He was just living differently. And because the changes had crept in slowly, he didn't quite realize how much he'd transformed until his family began pointing it out. It started with his daughter. She had stopped by on a Saturday afternoon, arms full of groceries. "Thought I'd stock your fridge before I head home," she said, setting down a bag of fresh vegetables and bread. As Christopher unpacked the bag, she leaned against the counter, watching him with a thoughtful expression. "You seem lighter," she said finally. "Not just in weight, though maybe that too, but in how you move. And your face, it's brighter." He chuckled, brushing it off. "Must be the lighting in here," he said. But she shook her head. "No, Dad. You look different, happier." Her words lingered in his mind long after she left. A few days later, during his regular Sunday dinner at his sister Margaret's house, it happened again. They were sitting around the table, passing dishes back and forth, when she stopped mid-sentence and looked at him. "Chris, are you glowing?" she asked with a laugh. The table erupted in light teasing. His nephew suggested he must have a secret romance, while his brother-in-law joked about him joining a spa club. But beneath the laughter, Christopher saw genuine curiosity in their faces. He shrugged, admitting he had been feeling better lately. "Just making a few changes," he said. Margaret raised an eyebrow. "Whatever you're doing, it's working. You look 10 years younger." Her tone wasn't exaggerated. It was simply the truth as she saw it. Christopher felt a warmth spread in his chest. He hadn't been chasing youthfulness, but it felt good to be seen that way. The real surprise came from his grandson, Daniel. One afternoon, they were in the backyard tossing a ball back and forth. After a few minutes, Daniel stopped, resting the ball under his arm. "Grandpa," he said matter-of-factly, "you're faster now. Last year you couldn't even catch me when we played tag." Christopher laughed, pretending to protest. "Maybe you've just gotten slower." But Daniel shook his head. "Nope, you're just better now." That simple statement hit Christopher in a way the adult compliments hadn't. Children notice the obvious. They don't sugarcoat. And if Daniel could see that change, then it had to be real. Later that evening, Christopher stood in front of his bathroom mirror, studying his reflection more closely than usual. His skin was indeed less dull, the dark circles under his eyes lighter, his posture was straighter, even his eyes, they seemed clearer somehow, as though they reflected the steadiness he'd been feeling inside. And then he noticed something else. He was smiling, not because he was trying to, but because it came naturally now. He realized that his family had noticed before he had because he had been too busy living inside the changes to see them from the outside. The steady energy, the better sleep, the lighter mood, they had all built on each other, shaping a new version of himself that others could see even before he fully recognized it. One Sunday afternoon, the whole family gathered for a picnic at the park. There were sandwiches and salads, laughter over old stories, and a game of frisbee that somehow drew Christopher in. He found himself running, really running, across the grass, stretching to catch the disc. When he made the throw back, a cheer went up from his daughter and nephew. "Look at him go," someone shouted. He laughed, catching his breath, realizing that a year ago he would have stayed on the blanket as a spectator. As the day wound down, Margaret put a hand on his shoulder. "Chris, I don't know what's in that tea you've been drinking, but keep drinking it." She smiled, and he knew she meant it. On the walk home, carrying a small bag of leftovers, Christopher thought about how different it felt to have his family see him thriving instead of worrying about him. He remembered the months after his high blood sugar warning, when every family gathering carried a subtle undercurrent of concern. They'd ask, "How are you feeling?" with a weight behind the words, as if bracing for bad news. Now those questions had shifted to teasing comments about his secret or playful challenges from Daniel to race him across the yard. It struck him that health wasn't just about how you feel, it was also about how the people who love you feel when they look at you. His family's smiles and jokes weren't just surface-level reactions, they were signs of relief. They could see he was taking care of himself, and that gave them a kind of peace too. That night, as he brewed his evening tea, Christopher felt a deep gratitude. The mango leaves had given him more than better blood sugar, clearer skin, or deeper sleep. They had given him back the version of himself his family knew and loved, the man who played with his grandson, joined in games at picnics, and laughed easily over dinner. And maybe most importantly, they had given his loved ones reassurance that he wasn't fading quietly into the background of life. As he sipped from his favorite mug, the steam curling toward his face, Christopher thought about how often in life we change without realizing it until someone else holds up a mirror for us. His family had done that for him, and in their eyes, he saw not just the progress he'd made, but the life he was reclaiming. And for the first time in a long while, he wasn't just living for his own well-being. He was living in a way that brought joy and comfort to the people who mattered most to him. By now, Christopher's mango leaf tea ritual had become so natural he could hardly remember what his mornings felt like without it. And yet he often found himself marveling at how something so ordinary, just a few leaves and some boiling water, could have sparked such a profound change in his life. There was nothing exotic about it, no elaborate preparation, no ingredient list you couldn't pronounce. It was as humble as it was powerful. One crisp morning, he found himself thinking back to the very first time Maria had placed the steaming cup in front of him. He had been skeptical, even amused. Tea made from mango leaves? It had sounded like one of those folk remedies you read about but never expect to actually work, and yet here he was, months later, healthier, lighter, and calmer than he had been in years. Sometimes, when friends asked him about the tea, they expected a complicated story, perhaps a secret brewing method, or a rare type of leaf imported from halfway around the world. But when he explained it was simply fresh or dried mango leaves steeped in hot water, they looked almost disappointed. "That's it?" one of them asked once, his brow furrowing. Christopher had smiled. "That's it, but you have to do it every day. That's where the magic happens." He had come to understand that the real magic wasn't in the leaves alone, but in the way they had reshaped his habits. Each morning, the act of making tea was a reminder to choose health. It was small, manageable, and so easy to keep up with that it became a foundation for other good choices. Walking a little farther, eating more vegetables, resting when he needed to. The tea had been the door he stepped through, the rest had followed naturally. One afternoon, Christopher visited Maria, and they decided to make tea together in her kitchen. She showed him how her grandmother used to prepare it, rinsing the leaves gently under cool water, shaking off the droplets, and laying them out for a moment in the sun. "She always said the sun woke up the goodness in the leaves," Maria explained with a fond smile. They sat at her wooden table, sipping their tea in comfortable silence, and Christopher thought about how these simple leaves carried not just health benefits, but a history. Generations had trusted them, long before anyone had put their compounds under a microscope. It made him realize how often the answers we look for are already around us, quietly waiting to be noticed. In his case, they had been hanging from mango trees all his life, ignored as he reached for the fruit and never thought about the leaves. He remembered running past those trees as a boy, never once imagining they held a key to his well-being decades later. As the weeks went on, Christopher became something of an unofficial ambassador for mango leaf tea among his circle of friends. Not in a pushy way, he didn't believe in lecturing people about their health, but when someone mentioned trouble sleeping, stubborn blood sugar, or constant fatigue, he would tell them his story. He'd offer to share a small bag of dried leaves, just to see if you like it. Some took him up on it, and a few even came back weeks later, saying they felt a difference. The simplicity of it was what made it powerful. There was no barrier to entry, no expensive equipment, no special skill. You could make it in a quiet kitchen in Brazil or in a tiny apartment in the middle of the city. You could drink it hot on a winter morning or iced on a summer afternoon. It was a habit that fit easily into any life, so long as you made the choice to begin. One Sunday, Christopher's daughter asked if she could join him for tea. She had been curious about it for weeks, hearing bits and pieces of his story, but never experiencing it herself. They sat together at his kitchen table, the steam curling between them. "It's peaceful," she said after a few sips. "Not just the tea, but the whole thing. I can see why you like it." Christopher smiled. "It's become my anchor," he admitted. "No matter what's going on, this is the part of my day that's steady." She nodded thoughtfully, and he could see a spark of understanding in her eyes. It wasn't about chasing quick fixes or grand transformations. It was about grounding yourself in something small and good every single day. That night, after she left, Christopher thought again about the word magic. People often used it to describe things they didn't fully understand. But he believed this was a different kind of magic, the kind that came from something simple, repeated with intention, until it quietly reshaped you. Mango leaf tea hadn't turned him into someone else. It had simply returned him to the best version of himself. And so, as he rinsed the leaves for his evening cup, he felt a deep sense of gratitude. For Maria, for his grandmother's mango trees, for the everyday miracle of health slowly restored by something so unassuming. He knew there were flashier solutions out there, bigger promises sold in shinier packages. But none of them could replace the quiet, steadfast magic of a few simple leaves and the life they had helped him reclaim. By now, Christopher's mornings had a rhythm as familiar and comforting as the sound of rain on the roof. He no longer woke with the heaviness that used to sit in his chest like a stone. Instead, he opened his eyes with a quiet anticipation, knowing that the first thing he would do was head to the kitchen and begin his tea ritual. It wasn't something he rushed through. If anything, he had come to think of those first minutes of the day as sacred. He moved slowly, the way you might handle a cherished object. He filled the kettle with fresh water, enjoying the cool feel of it against his fingers. He set it on the stove, the faint click of the burner lighting up the quiet kitchen. Then he reached for the jar of mango leaves on the counter, unscrewing the lid and breathing in their gentle, earthy scent. Every step had its place. The water began to hum softly, a promise of the whistle to come. He rinsed a few leaves under cool water, not hurrying, just letting the process wake him fully. Sometimes, if the morning was bright, he would hold them up to the sunlight streaming through the window, watching how the veins ran like tiny rivers through each leaf. When the kettle sang, he poured the water over the leaves in his favorite ceramic pot, the one his sister had given him years ago, its glaze a deep, calming blue. The steam rose instantly, curling upward in delicate spirals. He would close his eyes and inhale, letting the warmth fill his lungs, feeling the tension from the night melt away before he'd even taken a sip. While the tea steeped, he didn't distract himself with phones or television. He just stood there watching, breathing, listening to the faint tick of the kitchen clock. The world outside might already be rushing into its day, but here, in his kitchen, time moved differently. This was the part of the day he owned completely. When the tea was ready, he poured it into his mug, the pale amber liquid glowing in the early light. The first sip was always the best. It was warm and grounding, the faint sweetness lingering just enough to remind him why he had chosen this over coffee. That moment, the warmth in his hands, the taste on his tongue, felt like an affirmation, a quiet nod to himself that he was starting the day right. Over time, he realized this ritual was doing more than nourishing his body. It was teaching him patience. In a world where everything urged him to move faster, the tea asked him to slow down. It reminded him that good things didn't happen in a rush. You had to give them time for the leaves to release their goodness, time for your mind to settle, time for your body to notice the difference. The ritual had also become a way of checking in with himself. As he sipped, he would think about the day ahead, what needed doing, who he wanted to see, what small joys he could look forward to. On mornings when he felt unsettled, the tea seemed to help him find his footing again. On mornings when he felt strong, it seemed to carry that strength into the rest of the day. Sometimes, when Daniel visited, Christopher would invite him to join. The boy would help rinse the leaves, giggling as the cold water splashed his hands. Christopher would let him pour the hot water, carefully under watchful eyes, and together they would wait for the tea to steep. "Good things take time," Christopher would say, and Daniel would nod solemnly, as if learning an important secret. The ritual wasn't complicated, but it held layers of meaning. It connected Christopher to Maria, to his grandmother, to the generations who had brewed tea not just for health, but for comfort and connection. It was a thread running through time, linking him to people and moments long past, yet still alive in every sip. On days when he traveled or stayed overnight at his daughter's, he brought the leaves with him. The surroundings might change, but the ritual remained. Even in an unfamiliar kitchen, the steps felt the same, grounding him no matter where he was. That consistency became its own kind of medicine, a reminder that no matter what changed around him, there were still things he could count on. Christopher often thought about how different his mornings had been before this. Coffee gulped while skimming the news on his phone, rushing to dress, eating whatever was quickest. There had been no space for intention, no time to breathe before the day began. Now his mornings felt like an opening chapter written with care, setting the tone, steadying the hand, preparing the mind. It amazed him that the act of brewing tea could do so much, but he understood now that it wasn't just the tea, it was the choice, the daily decision to begin his day in a way that supported him, body and soul. That choice had rippled into the rest of his life, shaping how he ate, how he moved, even how he thought about himself. One morning, as he sat with his tea by the window, watching the light spill across the garden, Christopher realized something. This wasn't just a habit anymore. It was a way of living. And in that moment, he knew that no matter where life took him, he would carry this ritual with him. Not because he had to, but because it had become part of who he was. And so every day he would wake, walk into his kitchen, and begin again. Simple, steady, healing. It had been many months since Christopher first sipped mango leaf tea in Maria's kitchen. What had started as a quiet experiment, almost a whim, had now woven itself so deeply into his life that he could not imagine his days without it. Looking back, it surprised him how something so small, 1 cup of tea a day, could ripple out into such profound change. He thought about the man he had been before this began, tired more often than not, shoulders weighed down by the doctor's warnings, nights interrupted by restless thoughts, jeans that no longer fit, skin that had lost its spark, energy that came in short bursts and left just as quickly. He hadn't been unwell enough to draw alarm from strangers, but inside, he knew he was sliding slowly toward a place he didn't want to go. The tea hadn't been a magic cure, he would never call it that, but it had been the spark that lit a steady fire. Each cup reminded him that he could choose differently, that he could build health drop by drop. Those first changes had been subtle, steadier energy, calmer sleep, a lighter step, but they stacked up, one on top of the other, until the difference was undeniable. His blood sugar improved, his mind felt clearer, his body carried him more easily, and perhaps most importantly, his sense of control returned. Now every morning when he brewed his tea, he felt a quiet gratitude for what it represented. It was more than hydration or warmth. It was proof that change didn't have to roar. It could whisper. It could come in the steam rising from a cup, in the slow deepening of amber color as leaves released their goodness into water. Friends sometimes asked how long he planned to keep it up. "For as long as I'm breathing," he would answer with a smile. Why would he stop? The tea had become as much a part of his well-being as the walks in the park or the laughter with his grandson. It wasn't a phase, it was a way of living. One sunny afternoon, he met Maria for tea under the shade of an old oak tree in the park. They each brought a thermos, and as they poured, the scent drifted between them. "You've changed," Maria said, watching him with a warm smile. "You carry yourself differently now. You look like someone who trusts his body again." Christopher nodded slowly. "I do," he said, "and that's worth more than I ever realized." He had learned that good health wasn't about grand gestures. It wasn't about chasing trends or chasing perfection. It was about finding the things that work for you, the things you can do every day without strain, and letting them become part of your life. For him, that thing was mango leaf tea. It was simple, affordable, and rooted in tradition. It was also deeply personal now, tied to the memory of his grandmother's mango trees, to the kindness of a friend who had shared a gift without expecting anything in return. As the seasons passed, the ritual evolved with them. In the summer, he would brew it early and pour it over ice, sipping slowly as the day warmed. In the winter, he would linger over the stove, wrapping his hands around the hot mug for comfort. But whether hot or cold, in sunlight or frost, the meaning remained. His family noticed too. His daughter no longer asked cautiously about his health. She asked about his walks, his garden, his plans for the weekend. His grandson invited him to join in games without hesitation. And his sister, once concerned about his blood sugar, now teased him about being the healthiest one in the family. The transformation was no longer just physical. It touched how he saw himself. He was not a man quietly slipping into decline. He was someone choosing every day to invest in his future. The tea had given him the structure to do that, and in return, it had given him back more than he could measure. One morning, as he sat by the window with his steaming mug, he thought about the road ahead. There would still be challenges. Age didn't pause for anyone, but he knew he was better prepared to meet them. The fear that had once hovered at the edges of his life had loosened its grip. In its place was a sense of calm, of purpose. If someone had told him a year ago that a handful of mango leaves could do all this, he might have laughed. But now he understood the truth. The leaves were just the beginning. The real change came from the daily act of choosing them, of saying yes to himself over and over again. As the sun crept higher in the sky, Christopher finished the last sip of his tea, feeling its warmth settle into him. 1 cup a day, he thought, had become far more than a drink. It was a reminder, a habit, a promise to himself that he intended to keep for the rest of his life. And that was the magic, not in the leaves alone, but in the lifetime they had helped him reclaim. Christopher's story began quietly and with a warning from his doctor and a weight he carried in both body and spirit. He could have let that moment define the rest of his years, but instead he chose to change one small thing: a single cup of mango leaf tea each morning. From that choice, the changes began to ripple. His restless nights softened into peaceful sleep. His heavy steps grew lighter. His mind cleared. Old jeans that had long been tucked away fit once more. His skin brightened, his energy returned, and the quiet fear of illness loosened its grip. Even his family saw it before he did: the spark in his eyes, the spring in his walk, the laughter that came more easily. It wasn't a miracle, and it wasn't instant. But through that daily ritual, Christopher discovered the power of showing up for himself. One cup, one day, one choice at a time. He learned that real transformation doesn't roar, it whispers. It builds slowly until one day you look in the mirror and see not just the years you've lived, but the life you've reclaimed. And so, Christopher's journey is not just about tea, it's about finding that one small, sustainable change that becomes your anchor, the thing that carries you toward better health, steadier days, and a future you can step into with confidence. Because it's never too late to take the first step toward the life you want. And sometimes it begins with nothing more than a single cup in your hands,